Welcome to our Wednesday night AJA live Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, especially to those who are joining us live on Zoom, to those who are watching on our Facebook Live, watching our recording on YouTube, or listening in tomorrow morning on J-Air. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here. We have a very special guest this evening, and we are talking coalition policies impacting the Jewish community and Israel. Our special guest tonight is none other than the Honourable Julian Leeser, MP. There have been major changes to everyday life for Australian Jews under the current government. With an election around the corner, we are examining some of the coalition's policy impacting the Jewish community and Israel. Our guest, Julian Leeser, is a prominent advocate against anti-Semitism within Parliament. He is currently the coalition's only Jewish MP. Tonight we will be running a Q&A hosted by Dr. David Adler and Robert Gregory, followed by a Q&A from our audience. If you do have any questions for Julian, please wait for the second half of the evening, and you can use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. Thank you very much, and please welcome Julian Leeser.
Julian, thank you so much for agreeing to join the AJA event this evening. We're very grateful not only for you being here this evening, but also for some of the very strong positive work that you've done in your role as a Member of Parliament, and it is appreciated. And I want you to know that there are many people who are associated with AJA who really do appreciate the work that you're doing, and hopefully it will continue to have a more and more positive impact going forward. So needed. But my first question to you is a personal one. You really seem to have stepped up big time since the 7th of October 23. What is driving you? What's made that commitment for you?
Well, David, firstly, just let me say thank you for having me this evening. It's wonderful to speak to you. I know my colleagues Dan Tehan, Sarah Henderson, Michaelia Cash, and my predecessor as the Shadow Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, Claire Chandler, have also spoken to you. And I know you will have Mike Kelly presenting a Labor perspective in a few weeks. So it's wonderful to be with you in that context. Look, I don't think I've particularly stepped up since the 7th of October. I think I go back to my maiden speech. If you go and read my maiden speech, one of the central themes of my maiden speech is my great pride in being a Jewish Australian and great sense about what makes Australia so different to almost anywhere else on the planet, in that this has been a country that has been uniquely good to Jewish Australians. And, when we think about the history of Jewish Australians in this country, we are one of the few countries on earth that can pinpoint the date when Jewish Australians came to be in this country, and that was in the First Fleet, when there were a dozen Jewish convicts that stepped ashore in 1788 on Australia Day. And one of the rare things about Australia, and this is very rare in the context of human history, is that this is a country that has never had any official discrimination against Jewish people. And so as a result, when free people are able to worship God and live in a land freely, they flourish. And Jewish people have flourished in this country ever since and have contributed to all manner of activities. Behind me, you see a picture of my great grandfather, Sylvester Henry Brown. The official DFAT history of Israel states that he claimed to have been the first Jewish soldier from the British Empire to set foot in the land of Israel. He was involved in the battles around the Charge of the Light Horse at Beersheba. He's an example. My family having been in Australia since 1849, a very old Jewish family. But we are an example, as everyone on this call tonight is an example, of the way in which the community has flourished in this country. And so my very conception of being an Australian, my very conception of being a Jew in Australia, was really rattled to the core by both what we saw in Israel on October 7, but then also what we saw in our own streets subsequent to that time, and the failure of leadership that we've seen from the government, from universities, from some of the police, from organisations like the Human Rights Commission, who have as their charter dealing with and fostering social cohesion, And I felt that it was my job to defend the country that I love for the sake of my kids. I want to have an Australia where my children, where your children, where grandchildren, great-grandchildren, where anybody who abides by the law is entitled to the full protection of the law. So as well as having the picture of my great-grandfather in my office, I have a picture of my kids in my office. And I think every day, what am I doing to ensure that this country provides at least the same opportunities, if not more, for my children that I had? What am I doing to ensure their safety? What am I doing to ensure that this country is free and prosperous for them? And so I've seen, the issues since October 7 very clearly. And I've seen myself as a Jewish Australian in the federal parliament needing to stand up, because if I'm not out there arguing for our community, if I'm not arguing out there for the place of the state of Israel and our relationship with Israel, then who is?
Well put. Maybe the appearance of stepping up has been the actual workload that's involved in this subject, which has certainly expanded considerably since the 7th of October.
I should probably also say, David, I've always been a person, and this is very common for Jewish people generally, as we all know, I've always been a person that stood up for the rights and freedoms of others. I've stood up for the freedom of Christians from persecution. I represent a community that doesn't have very many Jewish Australians, but has a very large number of Christians and Hindus and Muslims and so on. And I've stood up for all of their rights because I think religious freedom is important, and the right of free people to be free and the right of people to practice their faith in accordance with their tradition is absolutely fundamental. And so that's something I've done right throughout my parliamentary career. And this is an extension of it, but it's a particularly special time because it's our community and our people that are in the gun so much.
Well, I'm going to draw a comparison. You might want to be a little bit more circumspect than me, but the most prominent Labor Jewish member of Parliament, Mark Dreyfus, we would not say has stood up. In fact, he's opposed some of the important initiatives like the proposed judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on university campuses. He was jeered at the anti-Semitism summit that Sky News convened in the Central Synagogue a few weeks ago. What's your observation of him? Are you able to make any observations, or do you want to take a pass on that?
No, look, I have been very critical of Mark Dreyfus, David, more in sorrow than in anger, if anything, because not only is he the most senior Jewish legislator in the country, but he's also a person who, as the Attorney General of the country, has at his disposal the awesome power of a range of institutions which are designed there and can be used to offer greater protection to the Jewish community of this country and to other law-abiding people. And he's either failed to step up or he had to be dragged kicking and screaming to get there. As you and other people on this call will know, I was on the front bench of our party, and I stood down from the front bench because I didn't agree with the position that my party had taken on The Voice. And I think I don't understand how Mr. Dreyfus has continued to serve in his cabinet. I don't understand how other people who have been in the Labor cabinet, who have claimed to be supporters and friends of the State of Israel, people like the Deputy Prime Minister, have continued to serve in that cabinet when this government has abandoned Israel with all its increasing anti-Israel resolutions that it's supported at the United Nations, with its funding of UNRWA, with what it has done with relation to not allowing a Ayelet Shaked to come here, with its disregard for the position of Jewish Australians. I couldn't have gone along with those things. I would have resigned from the cabinet a long time ago rather than continue to sit in while it was doing things that I think are fundamentally opposed to values that people like Richard Marles and Mark Dreyfus are supposed to represent within their party. And I've said this publicly too. I also think within his own role, Mr. Dreyfus is responsible for a range of institutions where he's failed to stand up. You mentioned that he failed to support the judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus. He also had to be dragged kicking and screaming to make amendments to the criminal law to provide for tougher penalties and tougher laws to deal with the anti-Semitism that we've seen in our streets. There were newspaper reports that, in fact, he opposed the mandatory minimum sentences and had to be overruled by the Prime Minister on those matters. We know as well that there has been deep anti-Semitism in the Human Rights Commission. And when I asked questions in the Parliament and questions on notice about what he was doing to clean up the anti-Semitism at the Human Rights Commission and to ensure himself that it had been that the Commission had ridden itself of that anti-Semitism, of that Jew hatred, he gave me one of those, "Oh, this is an independent statutory authority, there's nothing to see here." Well, when he was dealing with another independent statutory authority, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and he was unhappy with that tribunal, he famously called in a Chapter 3 judge into his office to have a please explain meeting. Why he couldn't have done that and reassured the Jewish community in relation to the Human Rights Commission beggars belief. So his performance has been very disappointing. It didn't surprise me in any way that the community reacted at the anti-Semitism summit in the way that they did, because his performance and his lack of standing up for our community at this difficult time is felt very deeply within the community, as many of the people on the call and elsewhere in the community know.
And I'll just add, David and I were at that conference, the anti-Semitism conference, and it wasn't a Labour thing. You know, everyone gave a standing ovation to the New South Wales Premier. So it really was that people could sense that Mark Dreyfus is not popular, is not doing his job.
Well, it's not just him; it's the whole government, Robert. I mean, I think Chris Minns and Steve Camper in the state government here, I think their heart is in the right place. They always come out hard. I think this is not a perfect state government by any means, and I think the police minister has not been as strong as she could have been. The huge mistake she made on the 9th of October with allowing the police escort down to the Opera House with those terrible scenes that have impacted Australia's reputation all around the world, and preferenced the rights of the protesters over the rights of law-abiding Jewish and other Australians. I think that hasn't been good. I think, the failure to act for a while with those protests that have been going on outside the Great Synagogue every weekend, she deserves criticism. But you can't fault people like Chris Minns and Steve Camper for the strong position and the strong words and the unequivocal way in which they have dealt with this issue.
So for the next question, what are some of the major policy differences between the coalition and the Labour government?
Well, look, let me start with going back to the time before the last election. Before the last election, senior Labor figures wrote in the Australian Jewish News that there would be no difference between the Labor Party and the coalition when it comes to our community or to the State of Israel. I've described that as the biggest lie that's ever been told in Australian politics, because even before October 7, the differences couldn't be starker. You had Labor changing the position in the most ham-fisted way of the capital of Israel, the recognition of the capital of Israel. A decision that was applauded by Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, a decision that embarrassed Australia on the world stage. You had changes to resolutions at the United Nations to the way in which we had voted, and you had the return of funding to UNRWA. That's even before October 7. And then after October 7, you had the moral equivalence with which the government approached the anti-Semitism that exploded on our streets. Anti-Semitism that always had to be met with a discussion of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is a bad thing. And when Islamophobia occurs, we should condemn it. But what we were seeing was a rise in anti-Semitism. And what we've seen in the last 18 months is a rise in anti-Semitism that is unprecedented in our history. Anti-Semitism that needed to be called out and dealt with on its own. And too often the government was half-hearted about it. Too often they had to be dragged kicking and screaming. We've talked about the changes to the criminal code in relation to some of the laws that were passed just recently. We've talked about the judicial inquiry that they failed to support. It took them almost a year to appoint a special envoy on anti-Semitism, and then when they did appoint her, they failed to listen to her recommendations on key things like the judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism, or the calling of a national cabinet to discuss stronger laws. When they finally did call a national cabinet, they didn't discuss stronger laws. They just discussed having a database. Even the doxing legislation, they took more than a year in relation to bringing that forward. So again and again, you've seen a government that just hasn't taken these matters seriously. And it took the firebombing at Adass Israel. It took the firebombing of the childcare centre in Maroubra to see them take action. And I think that that's tragic. I think, the community and its leadership have been rightly calling out for stronger measures for people to see the anti-Semitism that we were seeing in the arts and the universities, on our streets for what it was. The coalition, my leader, myself, James Patterson and others were calling these matters out clearly and strongly, and the government just was not taking this issue seriously. And then you look at the way in which they've handled the relationship with Israel. The Prime Minister has not been to Israel. It's almost a year since the Prime Minister, maybe even more than a year since the Prime Minister last spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Penny Wong, the day after the 7th of October terrorist attack, when people were still searching for their family members, when the terrorists had not been subdued, she said that Israel needed to exercise restraint. When she eventually visited Israel, she refused to go south to the kibbutzim and to the Nova Music Festival. I mean, can you imagine, after the September 11 terrorist attacks, Alexander Downer, the then Foreign Minister, going to America and not visiting Ground Zero? That was the equivalent of it. We've seen her fund UNRWA, despite the fact that it is notorious for having its employees involved in the October 7 terrorist attacks and having been the sort of communication centre in Gaza for the activities of Hamas. We have seen Australia support more and more anti-Israel resolutions at the United Nations. We have seen her compare Israel to Russia and China. I have said before that at the very least she's got a blind spot for Israel. We've seen within the Labor Party, those of us who've watched it closely over the last 20 years, every Labor Party conference, the resolutions get more and more and more anti-Israel, and nothing is going to change in the Labor Party in relation to that. We are seeing the fruit of that today in the Albanese government. There could not be a greater contrast with the Albanese government and the Liberal Party led by Peter Dutton. We've always been strong in supporting our community, but never more so than under Peter Dutton. I mean, you've seen the way in which we've led the debate on calling for stronger laws. You've seen the way in which we've led the debate in terms of calling out anti-Semitism. I thought it's worthwhile just highlighting a few things that the coalition will do when it comes to office. So we will support a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. We will call a national cabinet that actually looks properly at anti-Semitism and extremism. Rather than just having Operation Avalite, which only involves the federal police, we will involve the federal police, the state and territory police, ASIO, the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, the AUSTRAC, which basically looks at finances travelling around the world, and Border Force, together as a new anti-Semitism task force. We will issue a ministerial direction to tell the AFP that they need to prioritise anti-Semitism, including dealing with doxing and the public display of terrorist symbols. We will, in relation to any visa holders who've engaged in acts of anti-Semitism, they will be referred to have their visas immediately cancelled. We will change Section 501, that's the character determination test in the Migration Act, and backdate that to October 7, 2023, so that if you're on a visa and you've been engaged in anti-Semitic conduct since October 7, 2023, that will be a grounds for considering whether you have bad character and can have your visa terminated. We will support a $32.5 million security package for the community, including allowing armed guards to stand at schools and synagogues. We will commit $7.5 million in additional funding to Crime Stoppers. We will commit $8.5 million to the Centre of Jewish Life so that the Centre of Jewish Life and Tolerance become a reality. And on the global stage, as I've said many times, we will return to a foreign policy where we stand for our values and we stand with our friends. We won't sell out Israel in the way that this government has done so.
It's a big difference, Julian. We put together a document, you can just see the beginning of it here, which is the top 20 hostile acts by the Foreign Minister and Labor against Israel and the Jewish community. We could have included more than 20, and indeed a few of the ones that you've just mentioned are not in our top 20, so maybe we should have had a top 30 or 40 or 50. I don't know, but we've documented the top 20, at least as we saw it. And somehow that document got into the hands of members of the Knesset. I mean, who would have thought?
I should say, David, that this difference in policy in relation to Israel and the Jewish community between our two parties gives me no joy as a Jewish Australian. I would love to see these issues being beyond politics. I would love to see Labor return to the position they were in the time that Bob Hawke was Prime Minister, but they are not there. They are a long way from there.
Julian, what's your assessment on, I mean, a lot of people are worried, and I think with some justification, that we cannot return to a pre-7 October environment, that some of what's been unleashed is indeed irreversible. To what extent do you think it is reversible? To what extent are we now in a permanently more hostile environment?
Well, I'm a glass half full sort of person, David, but I'm not just being an unrealistic optimist here. I believe that so much of the difference in our country is leadership. Paul Keating famously says, when you change the government, you change the country. And I think the leadership from a Prime Minister, Peter Dutton, in terms of dealing with these issues, the prioritisation of dealing with anti-Semitism in the way that I've outlined a couple of minutes ago, will have a real effect. I've often said that running a society is no different to running a family. The child psychologists tell you that children crave boundaries, and they need you to enforce those boundaries because they'll just keep pushing against them until they are enforced. And running a society is no different. Societies need boundaries, and they need those boundaries enforced. And I think the fundamental difference you will see is a government that will enforce boundaries and will prioritise dealing with anti-Semitism in a way that we just haven't seen in the last 2 years. And I think that will send a very strong message to people about what will be tolerated and what won't be tolerated in this country. So I look forward to a new golden era for the Jewish community and for other law-abiding Australians, as we have a government that returns to a belief that those people who abide by the law are entitled to the full protection of the law. The anti-Semitism we are seeing on our streets, and I don't want to diminish it in any way, shape or form, but it is part of a broader species of lawlessness that we've been seeing, whether it is the increasing number of property crimes that are being committed in our suburbs, whether it's the graffiti, whether it's increasing drug crime, whether it's people flaunting our borders, whether it is the union lawlessness that is going on. The last few years, this government has been too tolerant of the lawlessness that we see. It's why we have put forward a range of different policies, even beyond the anti-Semitism space, to crack down on lawlessness, because people deserve to be safe, and because law-abiding people deserve the protection that they are all entitled to.
Let me ask you about two specific boundaries, and then I'll hand back to Robert. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, as you know, was initially proclaimed as policy by former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. It was also endorsed by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. but it hasn't really been implemented, even to organisations that receive federal funding like the universities. So I'd like you to comment on, can the IHRA actually be implemented? Would the coalition do it? And I'm sure there's been consideration to that. But I also want to raise another boundary, which is anti-BDS legislation. A lot of people would say that anti-Zionism is the new form of anti-Semitism. And as I'm sure you know, the majority of American states have anti-BDS laws. It doesn't restrict free speech in any way because it has to exist alongside the First Amendment. But what it does do is it imposes also restrictions on government money. So you can say what you like, do what you like. If you want to boycott Israel as a private individual or business or whatever, go for it. But if you put your hand out for government money, that's where the boundary is. So what are your thoughts on the implementation of the IHRA, and would Australia consider anti-BDS legislation?
So on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, I should say firstly, David, that I've chaired through, been one of the co-chairs throughout this Parliament of the Parliamentary Friends of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And that's a group co-chaired by myself, by Josh Burns and Allegra Spender. And at my suggestion, the first thing that we did was actually pick up the good work of Alan Tudge when he was Education Minister, and write off to the universities, this was back in 2022, to encourage them to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, because as we know, anti-Semitism on campus has been a problem long before October 7. We were warned about it in various surveys done of university students. August has been warning about it for a long time. So we really needed to focus on it. And having been a university administrator myself, I had the sense that this was a potentially fruitful thing for us to do. And having a tripartisan, as it were, group that spearheaded putting it forward, I thought would be effective with relation to the universities. Well, when we wrote off to the universities, I think about 4.5 of them have adopted the definition, and the half one is one that's adopted it without examples. And it's really been hugely disappointing but unsurprising that even before October 7, that universities have not adopted it. We have said, it might interest you to know that some of the universities have adopted a different definition in recent weeks. That definition is not a satisfactory definition. And we believe that the IHRA definition, we the coalition believe that the IHRA definition is the right definition, and you can't properly deal with anti-Semitism if you don't recognise what is and isn't anti-Semitism, particularly in its modern manifestations. And so we are going to require all universities to adopt and implement the IHRA definition. And it's universities which are really the sort of the key place for this to happen, because of course what happens in universities today affects what sort of society we will be in the future, because universities are where the nation's next generation of leaders go to be formed. It's not just about Jewish staff and Jewish academics, it's about what our society tolerates. And if we tolerate anti-Semitism and people learn on campus that, you know, you can protect the rights of all manner of other minorities, but when it comes to Jews, they don't count, then we're setting ourselves up for a very appalling society in the future. So that's why what's happening at universities is so important. That's why it's so important that we mandate the IHRA definition. There's obviously other places where the definition can be very useful across government, and we'll be looking at that more broadly. In relation to the BDS legislation, I'm not familiar with the legislation that's been implemented in the United States in several of its jurisdictions. But I can say, whereas the coalition have no truck with BDS at all, it's just extraordinary that it's the sort of usual double standard we see all too often in relation to Israel, that it is meted out a punishment that is not applied to any other democracy. We don't have a boycott, divestments and sanctions movement against Iran or North Korea. We just have it in relation to Israel, and we think about all the different products that come out of Israel, all the different learning that comes out of Israel, all the different opportunities for Australia that come from Israel, that we would be denying ourselves if BDS was implemented here. And I think the way in which BDS, it looked as though a few years ago it had been vanquished, but it reared its ugly head at the Sydney Festival a couple of years ago, which was terrible. And I think it's been on the march again as a result of some of these anti-Semitic and anti-Israel protests that have gone on since October 7. So we do need to deal with it. But we don't have at this point any proposal in relation to the legislation. But I'm looking forward to going and having a look at some of those legislative arrangements. David, you've set me a good bit of homework there.
I'll help you with the homework. We have a draft bill.
Thank you.
Yeah. Robert, anything from you?
Yes, I'll ask a bit of a more tricky question because I'm sure if I don't ask it, one of the Q&A people will. On the two-state idea. So we know the Israeli government is against the creation of a Palestinian state. The majority of Israeli Jews are against it. The majority of Arabs in Israel and other areas are against it, obviously for opposite reasons. And we saw in last week's Jewish news that the majority of Australian Jews who answered the poll, an overwhelming majority, were against it. So in light of new ideas coming up, whether it's President Trump's idea or other ideas, would the coalition be open to, a change of policy or open-minded to other ideas besides the creation of a Palestinian state?
Look, our policy, Robert, is and remains that we do support a two-state solution. What we don't support is what the government has been doing at the moment, which is the unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, particularly in the context where so many of the Palestinian organisations do not recognise Israel's fundamental right to exist, and when there are all the final status issues to be negotiated. We don't believe that a Palestinian state should be created without those issues being dealt with. Look, I look back over the history of the modern state of Israel, and so often there have been offers for a Palestinian state put forward. They have all been rejected, even some of the most generous offers made in the early 2000s by Ehud Barak when he was Prime Minister. And I think today, given the events of October 7, we don't seem that it doesn't look like that a Palestinian state is any closer. But as a matter of principle and as a policy goal, subject to those qualifications, that does remain coalition policy.
Yeah, we might ask one more question just before we go to Q&A. We mentioned before the judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on university campuses, which I'll just mention AJA also supports. So why is that so important, and why isn't the government going ahead with it?
Well, I think a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism is so important, as I said, because what happens on campus today reflects what happens in society tomorrow. Universities are the place where the next generation's leaders go to be formed. And what we've seen across our university sector, it's not limited to one particular campus, although there are some universities that are worse than others, is this terrible anti-Semitism directed both at staff and at students. You've had staff spat at, you've had university academics officers urinated on, you had Stephen Prower, the head of the 5As, the Australian Academic Alliance Against Anti-Semitism, appear before a parliamentary committee and then have his office ransacked and threatened, and university authorities sort of stand by. You've had the events at Sydney University where Hizb ut-Tahrir, an organisation listed in many countries as a terrorist organisation, effectively gets to run the ruler over defence contracts as a result of the behaviour of protesters there. You've had anti-Semitic theories and ideas taught in our classrooms. You've had students who wanted to have a Shabbat dinner in their university college, finding that Palestinian flags are shoved under their door the next day. I just think what university students and Jewish staff are having to put up with on campus is intolerable. I think the university vice-chancellors are looking just to keep the peace. That there is a culture in too many of our universities that, look, this is just what Jewish students have to put up with for free speech. I do not believe that is true. I think that the university leaders have abrogated their responsibility. They've abrogated their responsibility to Jewish students and staff. They've abrogated their responsibility to every other student and staff member there by their failure of leadership. And when you have a cultural failure across an entire sector, and when you have university leaders unwilling and unable to deal with these issues properly, the only thing that you can do to get cultural change across the entire sector is to have a judicial inquiry. We saw that in relation to the banking and financial services sector. We saw that in relation to institutional responses to child sexual abuse, that it's only when you have these judicial inquiries, when you lift a lid, when you don't put a vice-chancellor on a panel with 4 other vice-chancellors and ask them questions for half an hour, as the parliamentary committee did, and most of them say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question, it's about a private case. When you do that at a parliamentary committee, you make a mockery of the process, and you basically say that you're not taking the issue seriously. And that is the charge I level at the government for the parliamentary inquiries it's held. Only a judicial inquiry where you've got a vice-chancellor on the stand for days, where they are being grilled by the top silks in the land, where the inquiry is presided over by a judge who can search and seize documents and who can exercise strong powers against those who refuse to cooperate. Only then will you get to the bottom of this anti-Semitism. Only then will you be able to put forward a full suite of recommendations that deal with everything from the role of representative organisations to what's taught in the classroom, to the governance and management of universities, to the policies they have, to the complaints handling procedures, to the both real and de facto BDS events that are occurring with relation to visiting Israeli academics, and in relation to important academic work that should be done with Israeli institutions, particularly at a time where we are grateful to Israel as a country for the intelligence and security assistance that they provide us in foiling terrorist attacks on our own shore. We should be actually increasing our relationship with Israel at this time, not pushing it away. So I think the judicial inquiry is absolutely vital. This started as an idea that I first raised in November 2023. I prepared a private member's bill for it in May of 2024. I did lots of consultation, including with the AJA and others. And I have to say, I was delighted when it became coalition policy last year, and Peter Dutton announced it at Dover Heights on October 7, 2024. And I think, the judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus not only will be very good for Australian universities, but it will be a case of Australia leading the world in terms of the way in which we will deal with anti-Semitism and the seriousness with which we'll take its manifestations on our campuses.
Well put, and a great initiative. So just the 1-minute promo now. As we do each week, at the end of the event, if you're not yet actively supporting AJA, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au. You can become a supporter, make a donation. We need lifters, not leaners, and always need active support. Next week, we're talking about taking on the Teals with Harriet Wall-O'Shill, who's a lawyer, researcher, activist. And we did make an announcement that our social media in February had set a new record with exceeding 10 million views in aggregate, which is quite extraordinary. I used to say we're 10 times the size of number 2. I think we're closer to 20 times the size of number 2 in this country. And also, if you want to show your support for Israel and the Jewish community in something you wear, we have the AJA online shop for Israel supporters with a small range of merchandise. So, Tennille for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Julian. We'll go to our Q&A now. Alan Friedman.
Thanks to Neil and thanks, Julian. Um, I would say that the level of support from the Islamic community leaders, even before October 7, but certainly since then, has been deafening in its silence. And I would also say that they are part of the problem. You mentioned you have a Muslim component of your electorate. So I'm wondering what experiences and responses have you had from your Islamic community and that in general, and have you been satisfied with it?
Well, Alan, I'll say this. When the Christchurch terror attacks happened a couple of years ago, the very next day I went to the mosque in my electorate because I wanted to be with my constituents who would have been fearful potentially of going to their house of worship. One of the things I think about this country that's made it great is that we believe in the freedom of worship. We believe in the rights of free people to be able to worship their God in their own way. And as I said to my constituents in the Muslim community at the time, what happens to you happens to me. So it was very important that I was there. And indeed, the mosque in my electorate moved a resolution that formed part of the resolution of the Australian Senate when the resolutions on that matter were debated in the House. I have to say that I have been disappointed that I haven't had more people reaching out from not just the Muslim communities, but a range of communities across the country. I think there are more things that people could do. At the end of last year, the Catholic bishop in my area, Bishop Anthony Randazzo, and I were having a discussion, and I said to him, for the first time in a long time, Christmas and Hanukkah fall on exactly the same day. And we came up with an idea that churches right across my electorate, the churchgoers, would put a candle in their window on Christmas night. And we held a gathering of church leaders, as well as lay leaders of the community, and Rabbi David Lewin from the North Shore Synagogue in Sydney. Those church leaders committed to doing that right across my electorate. And indeed, I went on Christmas night to midnight mass. And if you think about it, midnight mass for a Catholic priest, let alone a bishop, is like Kol Nidre for us. And rather than talking about other issues, Bishop Anthony Randazzo spent that evening talking about anti-Semitism and the need to stand with our Jewish brothers and sisters. And even just talking about it makes me feel emotional because it was such a wonderful act to do. And he has, I think, 40 churches across his diocese that go further beyond my own electorate. And so he instructed people across those dioceses to give homilies, sermons, and to encourage the parishioners to put lights in their windows. So that was a wonderful act. I think often when we're thinking about what we can get our friends and allies to do, there are many people that want to do good things and want to stand with us. And I see this every day, not only in my own electorate, but when I travel around the country, random non-Jewish strangers will stop me in the street. Often they will come and give me a hug and say, "Thank you for standing up against anti-Semitism. Thank you for standing with for our values." And they often want to do things, but they don't quite know what to do. And I think sometimes it can be helpful for us to make suggestions about things that we'd like to do. Purim is about to be upon us. Pesach is coming. It's a mitzvah to have some of our non-Jewish friends with us at Pesach, particularly, as well as our Jewish friends who've got nowhere else to go. That can be something that we can do, but I think you can start a conversation with our non-Jewish friends about how we'd like to see them stand up more.
Thank you. Philip, would you like to unmute, please?
Hi, Julian, thank you very much for the work you do. My question relates to what you said before in your policy that you will revoke visas or citizenships of people who are pro-Hamas supporters. What worries me, that's a very noble action, but what worries me is that these pro-Hamas activists have got lots of money to pay lawyers. And what worries me then is that they will fight you in the courts, and who knows what the judges will do, and you might find yourself, stymied in what you want to do. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, we live in a country where the rule of law exists, and the rule of law means that people are entitled to go to courts and challenge government decisions. And we might not always like the decisions of courts or tribunals. That's why we have appeal processes. And ultimately, if the matters go to the High Court and it doesn't relate to an interpretation of the Constitution, we can change the law. And Peter Dutton has even said that in relation to some of these visa cancellation matters, if these matters relate to something to do with the Constitution, that he's willing to countenance a referendum on those issues. We take these issues seriously, but people do have the right to challenge decisions. That is what it is to be in a country that believes in the rule of law. That's always a value that's worth fighting for. It's something we share with the state of Israel, that the government of Israel, governments of various stripes in Israel, don't always like decisions of the courts, but that is part of living in a democracy that respects the rule of law.
Thank you. Josh, would you like to unmute, please?
Thanks, Daniil. Hi, Julian. Josh Basara here from the Epoch Times. Just want to ask, on the Mark Levin program this week, he spoke about how much American universities are funded by Middle Eastern entities, particularly Qatar, to promote anti-Western and socialist ideologies to students. So how much is this foreign funding also happening in Australia, which no doubt contributes to the anti-Semitism we're seeing on our campuses? And what would a coalition government do to try and stop the teaching and funding of these ideologies?
Thanks, Josh, for that question. I really wish the government would have spent more time listening to Gillian Siegel, the special envoy on anti-Semitism, who they appointed, because one of her most important contributions, I think, has been in response to my bill for a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus, has been to raise this exact issue. And this has really got to be, in my view, an issue that is the subject of the judicial inquiry, because it's the only way to look at these matters properly. The Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, when I served on it under James Patterson, looked at some of these issues a few years ago, and not particularly in relation to anti-Israel or anti-Western financing questions, but looked at issues of foreign financing in a more broad context, and in particular a national security context. And I think these matters would be properly matters that a judicial inquiry could examine.
Thank you. Anthony, please unmute.
Thanks, Hazel, pronoun she, her. Julian, thank you for all your work. As we know, the Greens are a big threat in the upcoming election. And I know Advance Australia and a number of us, I'm a member of the Liberal Party, are going to work really hard to try and diminish their support. And then another strategy is going to be to try as much as possible to shame Labor for preferencing the Greens. My concern is I've heard that in Watson, the Liberals are considering sharing preferences with the Muslim vote. Much as we'd love to get rid of Tony Burke, I'm not sure that it makes sense that this is a consideration. And I was just wondering what your comment is, and maybe you can tell me that's been ruled out, which would be great.
So look, I think the first thing to say to you is back in November 2023, I called for the Greens to be put last by every major political party, because they are a party that has effectively called for the genocide of a people when they run around chanting from the river to the sea. They are the party of anti-Semitism. I've used that phrase in the federal parliament. I've used that elsewhere. We've seen people like Jenny Leong talking about Jews not having the right to participate in the public life of this country, that they've got tentacles. We've had people denying that Hamas is a terrorist organisation. We've had Greens candidates denying that the rapes on October 7 took place. We have had Marine Fariki, who is a senator, stand next to a photograph of somebody putting a Magen David in the bin saying "keep the world clean," and the list goes on and on and on. So we have been trying to. Peter Dutton very early in the piece agreed to put the Greens last. We have been trying to shame the Labor Party into putting the Greens last. That is not something that they have been willing to do. And this is the hypocrisy of Prime Minister Albanese. He talks a big game in the Parliament when he wants to have a go at the Greens for something he doesn't like. But if he actually wanted to do something about this, and this is another test for him, if he actually wanted to do something about these issues, he would put the Greens last. The Greens need to be given the treatment today that One Nation was given in the 1990s. That's, for me, and for those in our party, we feel very strongly about that. And we've done the right thing, and we need Labor to do the right thing. You know, if there are 4 Greens MPs at the moment, there's Adam Bant in Melbourne. There are 3 Greens MPs in Queensland. If the Labor Party, if those Greens get re-elected, they will get re-elected because of the preferences of the Labor Party. And the Labor Party will have only itself to blame if they don't like the Greens being in the next Parliament. But of course, we know the Labor Party and the Greens have been in coalition. They are in coalition in some of the territories, and they have been in coalition in Tasmania. We know that there's really only 2 options at this election: a majority coalition government or a Labor Greens Teals government. Let me put this thought into your mind at the moment. In New Zealand, the Foreign Minister is a man called Winston Peters. He has been the Foreign Minister of New Zealand under successive governments, both National and Labor. He is not a member of the National Party or the Labor Party, and yet he has been the Foreign Minister of New Zealand. Imagine a scenario where the Labor Party is looking for confidence and supply, where they're looking to form a stable government, and Adam Bant says, I will do that, but I want to be the Foreign Minister of Australia. Just let that thought sink in. Can you imagine what it would be like with Foreign Minister Adam Bant? We think things are bad now under Foreign Minister Penny Wong. How much worse would they get under Foreign Minister Adam Bant? So we need to continue to pressure the Labor Party to keep the pressure on the. We need to keep the pressure on the Labor Party to put the Greens last. In relation to the Muslim vote, look, I've read some articles in the newspaper about this, but I haven't heard any Liberals say at any point that there's any intention for us to preference the Muslim vote. Ultimately, these are matters for the state directors, but I've certainly heard nothing to suggest that we're going to preference them.
Thank you. Dina, please unmute.
Thank you, Julian. In Australia, we have an increasing demographic imbalance, and I wonder if the coalition has any room to move on our immigration policy.
When you had my colleague and friend Dan Tehan talking to you a couple of weeks ago, and he would have been the person to give you a sense of what our migration policy is going to be. One of the things that we have said that we will do is that we're going to cut the migration rate over the next little while, because migration is good. We are all migrants. But unfortunately, we have more migrants in this country today than we can house. And so there needs to be a pause in the migration rate. And particularly in relation to housing policy, we need to preference Australians that are already here in relation to housing. And that's why we've said that we're going to cut back on the rights of non-citizens to purchase property here as well. But in terms of the sort of broader migration policy, that would have been other than those matters with relation to migration and housing, and what I've said previously in relation to the character determination about removing people. I think those questions would have been better directed towards my friend Dan Tehan, because those are really some of the key points we've made about the migration policy.
Thank you. Cohen, please unmute.
Look, I think that what's been spoken about tonight is nothing different from everything that's got us into the problem that we have. You have mainly in Australia just one group that is, it doesn't matter whether they're represented in parliaments right throughout the Middle East, America, anywhere else, that they come up with problems of interfering with the freedoms of other people. And we all know who that is. Now, if we passed a law in this country, a simple law, and a law of freedom, in which every person or no person or group can interfere or intimidate any other group or person, whether inside or outside the home, and to do so you would be guilty of restricting the freedom of another person or group and be liable for punishments of deportation, jail.
Sorry, just the final question for Julian, please. We're almost out of time.
And also making a fine for any group that interferes with anyone else's freedoms.
I think maybe that's more of a statement. Maybe we'll go to the...
Robert, can I just say in response to some of those initial comments that I support a race-blind migration policy that's been absolutely fundamental to Australia for decades, and I don't support any change to that. But what I do support is the policies that we have said in dealing with anti-Semitism here, that we will refer any visa holders that have been involved in anti-Semitism, in acts of anti-Semitism, for immediate cancellation and deportation, and for changes to Section 501, the Character Determination in the Migration Act, to ensure anti-Semitic conduct is captured by the law, and retrospectively apply that to October 7. I support measures in the migration sphere to say that if people engage in acts of anti-Semitism, we don't want them in this country if they're visa holders. But I do support a race-blind migration policy that's been fundamental in this country, and that has strong bipartisan support.
Thank you, Julian. For our final question for the night, we like to put it back onto our guests, and we like to ask you, we have a very active and wonderful base of supporters. What can we do to support you? How can we help? We have a lot of people who would love to volunteer. I know there's an election coming up. What more can we do to support you?
Well, thanks to Neil. Obviously, we do have an election coming up. If people want to find out how to support me, they can go to my website, julianleeser.com.au. You can look at ways of making a donation or getting involved in the campaign. Election campaigns are thirsty activities in terms of volunteers, and we want to have lots of people on helping up with the door knocking, with pre-poll, with street stalls and the like. Or if Barara is too far away for you, you're welcome to go and help any one of my fellow Liberal Party candidates around the country, because as we've said earlier in the piece, this election is one of great consequence for Jewish Australians. It's great consequence for freedom-loving people. And we want to make sure that Peter Dutton has a strong mandate to get Australia back on track. And I'd love to see you all involved in helping with that.
Julian Leeser, thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to join us tonight, for giving us that wonderful Q&A, informative, answering our questions, and for giving us responses that people can get behind and feel supported, proud, and confident of their Judaism and confident of the direction that our country is going in. Thank you again, everyone. I can see in the chat is wishing you all the best and thanking you. You did hear that. If you do want to support and volunteer, you can go to Julian's website. You're always welcome to email us, the team at AJA, and we can point you in the right direction, as we did last week, how to get further involved with supporting the parties and the upcoming election. To everyone, I'll remind you that this was recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook. Please share the recording with family, friends, and everybody who needs to hear this important message. I wish you all a huge Purim Sameach. I'd like to remind everybody that we have our Small Parties Forum in New South Wales. That will be this Sunday, which is now online. And on the 23rd of March, that will be Sunday, live in person in Melbourne. I'd also like to squeeze in that I am hosting a young professionals Purim party tomorrow night up in Sydney. We've sold about 200 tickets, so that'll be a wonderful opportunity for 20s and 30s to come celebrate Purim, be proud of their Judaism, and just an inspiring thing that I think everybody should know about is happening in the community. And Purim Sameach. It's a wonderful holiday. It's full of joy. It is one of my favorite holidays in the Jewish calendar. I hope you all go to synagogue, listen to the Megillah, dress up, enjoy, and be proud of who we are. Thank you again, Julian. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Tennille. And in the words of the Megillah, we were made for such a time as this.
Good evening.